Hello, I'm Des Dearlove. Welcome to the Thinkers 50 studio in the heart of London. My guest today is Rita McGrath. Rita is a professor at Columbia Business School and one of the world's leading experts on strategy. Her new book is called The End of Competitive Advantage. Rita, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the new book. You say right in the first chapter, you say strategy is stuck. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you think about the models and frameworks that have had impact on the field in the last 20, 30 years, I mean, what's really new? You know, we've had a lot of reliance on frameworks from the past that worked for a different era. And I can't think of anything that's really had a big impact in the last 20 years. And I think that's because we're still looking for this mythical thing called a sustainable competitive advantage. And if you can't find one of those, then what do you do?
Now, the two fundamental assumptions of strategy makers were, one, that industry matters most, and two, that we're searching for a competitive advantage, and when we find it, that it will be sustainable. You say both of those things are up in the air. Can you explain?
Well, the reason that I think it's important to note that industry isn't the major issue anymore is we used to think about, if you go back to the days of like the corn wet milling case or Crown Cork and Seal, you were competing to be in a relative market share game with other competitors in your industry. Today, what we're seeing is that it's actually industry to industry competition. So an example that I like to use is today, spending on communications and iPhones and other gadgets is actually eating away at the money that used to be spent on restaurants, on dining, on automotive, on travel. And so if you're a steakhouse, let's say, and you think you're competing with other steakhouses and that's how you're thinking about the world, you're going to be missing something very important.
And if competitive advantage is no longer sustainable, then we really are talking about redefining the whole nature of strategy, aren't we?
Well, I think you're quite right. I think getting rid of the sustainable concept does redefine the entire competitive landscape. And I think what we're going to see in the future is firms that succeed over the long run are going to be really good at finding ideas, developing those ideas into business concepts, launching those business concepts, doing the exploitation thing, which was what strategy was always all about, but then also disengaging. And where I think firms are going to need to change is to develop both the front end, the innovation, incubation, launch phase, as well as the back end, the disengagement phase. And so what you're going to be seeing is it's almost as though they're surfing through these waves of advantage. You'll have one wave come and then it goes away, another wave come and then it goes away. And firms that are good at it are going to be okay with that.
Okay, so if the strategy landscape is really changing the way you say, what does that mean for the old tools? What does that mean for Porter's Five Forces? What does it mean for the Boston Matrix? I mean, after all, a whole generation of managers grew up using those tools.
You're absolutely right. A whole generation of managers did grow up with all those tools, you know, Five Forces, Boston Matrix, all those things. And those still work in the right boundary conditions. They still work when you're exploiting an advantage that's fairly easy to define and your major competition is other firms within that category. Where I think those tools no longer work is the whole innovation phase and the disengagement phase. And if I were to say one place where those tools just don't have anything to say at all, it's what about disengagement? You know, what about landline telephony or dial-up internet or physical phone books? You know, what do those tools have to say about those kinds of things? And, you know, there's been some work on exits and exit barriers and so forth, but we haven't really taken it on as a mainstream function of strategy. Similarly, we haven't really taken on innovation as a mainstream function of strategy. You know, strategy traditionally has been about that exploitation phase where you're really, you know, things are more stable. And I think right now we're having to think about, well, what tools do I use when things aren't so stable?
Well, of course, in the past we talked about barriers to entry, but it sounds as though what you're saying is that now we've got to start thinking in terms of barriers to exit.
Absolutely. That's a really smart comment, this notion of barriers to exit, because one of the things that I argue in the book firms are going to do differently is they're going to be much more careful about sinking lots of assets and lots of investment into specific competitive places. Because if you need to move fast, you don't want a lot of fixed assets. You want to be able to use assets that are fairly fungible. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that it's access to assets rather than ownership of assets, which we're going to see as the defining issue in how you spend resources going forward.
Okay, so if strategic advantage is no longer sustainable, what should managers and leaders be doing? I mean, what's the agenda for them?
I think the difference in leadership behavior that you're going to be seeing is an emphasis much more on information traveling fast. So in the book, I use the example of Ford and Alan Mulally at Ford, who basically said you can't manage a secret. So, we're going to see a lot less of the management of bring me the numbers, hit the goals, don't bring me bad news, don't bring me a problem that you don't have a solution to. That kind of management, which works really well when things are stable, we're going to see that going away. We're going to see a lot more leadership that involves influencing people, getting people engaged. We're going to see much more candor, much more emphasis on being realistic, and also much more emphasis on keeping individuals and networks engaged. Because in the past, you used to be able to say a hierarchical reward was going to be the thing. So you start off at level 14 and you end up at level 2, and that's nirvana. And I think much less of that is going to be how we manage careers in the future, how leaders engage people in the future.
You talk in the book about innovation proficiency. What is innovation proficiency, and how can companies achieve it?
So I think you're absolutely right. Strategy and innovation, which used to be, when I started my professional career, innovation was like over there, that weird thing that people in painter hats put backwards would do. And strategy, was all about positioning and markets and so forth. And now I really think they're converging. So one of the things I argue that companies need to get better at is developing what I call an innovation proficiency. And what that involves is having funds for it, having a governing mechanism for it, having people who actually do it for a living. It used to be innovation was always a great job, but a lousy career. And what we're going to see now is companies actually building out that capability in a very systematic way. So the Australian logistics company Brambles, which has a really exciting business, they were founded on the basis of thousands of pallets left behind by the armed troops after World War II in Australia. And they get paid for shipping these pallets all around the world. Now, you wouldn't think a company like that would be a hotbed of innovation, and yet they've really turned it into a systemic capability. And among the things that they do that are really powerful is the CEOs made a decision that one of the biggest barriers to innovation is for a P&L manager. What do you do if it doesn't work? Oh my God, it's going to show up in my numbers, it's going to make me look bad. So what he's done is he's actually allocated funds in such a way that if the business succeeds, the P&L manager gets all the credit, but if it doesn't work out, corporate takes the hit. And so as a consequence, instead of the usual manager's response, which is, oh, I don't want those innovation things, they're too risky, they're like, bring it on, give me as many as you can because it's only upside. And so that's an example of the kind of feature that companies that are good at innovation get to do.
So let's be absolutely clear. We're not saying that competitive advantage isn't sustainable anyway. There are still pockets of it in the economy. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say there are still pockets of the economy where you can find sustainable advantage. So, take Rolls-Royce or Steinway pianos or something like that. They're niche businesses where the brand really matters, or the customers are super loyal, or they're, like Boeing, it's just really, really hard to build airplanes. So I still think there are places where you can find sustainable advantage, and the traditional tools, I would say, work pretty well in those places. Where we're having to grapple, I think, with something really new is that less and less of the economy is represented by those kinds of industries, those kinds of characteristics.
And how are your ideas different to some of the other strategy thinkers? I'm thinking in terms of 1990s, we had Rich Devaney's hyper competition, and we had Blue Ocean strategy, in both cases talking about the transient nature of competitive advantage.
So it's interesting to question whether what I'm writing about is really different than what's come before. And certainly we had Ian McMillan back in the 80s talking about seizing strategic opportunity. We had Rich Devaney in the 90s talking about hyper-competition. Certainly we've had Blue Ocean Strategy, which I think was 2005. So I think all of us are seeing the same phenomena, except we're coming up with a different response to it. And I think the big difference in what I'm doing versus what's come before is to say, okay, let's accept it. Once you've gotten over the shock and awe of, oh my God, advantage is gone, how do we now develop strategies and develop companies that can manage this? And I think we still have a lot of work to do. Because if I look at how companies are actually run, not very many of them are actually run with this notion that strategy has got to change and that you've got less sustainable ways of operating. So just as an example, typically we think about careers, as steps up a ladder. And I think increasingly we're going to have to think of careers as you know, the popular word is gigs, or in today's Harvard Business Review, they're calling it tours of duty. So increasingly we're going to see people building careers that may be spanning multiple companies, that may be spanning multiple experiences. They're not going to be all one kind of career anymore. And that has big implications for individuals, for how you prepare. And so I think the big aha to me is that we need to manage really differently if we accept this idea of not sustainable advantage.
Presumably too, that means that stability at this point, which we used to assume that that was the norm, stability now becomes dangerous.
Yeah, I would say stability's risky. By the time you need change management, is what I've been saying lately, it's almost too late. You know, you want to be in continual motion. And I would say that there are some things you want to keep stable as an organization. You want stability in values. You want stability in leadership. You want stability in your core reason for being. And in some of the work that underlies the book, I actually found firms that were capable of super success in this very dynamic environment combined stability with motion. So they had a lot of stability in things like values and talent and networks and developing people, and incredible dynamism in investments and locations and how they move people around. And so it's this combination of stability with dynamism that seems to be the trick.
Rita McGrath, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.